Shema Yisrael, Yahu Eloheinu, Yahu Echad, Baruch Shem Kebod Malkotho Leholam Voed.
Shalom, everyone. I am the Chief Magician of Mystery Babylon, and welcome to my holy channel. So I'm going to go really deep in this podcast. This is podcast 8, and it is entitled The Gnostic Eob. And we're going to go so deep that I'm going to discuss very esoteric Kabbalistic matters that quite honestly have never been revealed. This will be the first time for probably a few thousand years that this wisdom is going to be revealed. So, but before I get into it, I'd like to begin a brief exordium. So, as is well known, the global population has been dumbed down. The global population has immensely retarded. And so one of the problems that we have is that the educational curriculums in the Western world have been dumbed down immensely. It was just, a couple of hundred years ago that the ancient classics and philosophy and theology were part of the were part of the educational curriculum of the youth. They no longer are. And so what we see around the world is a tremendous amount of stupidity and ignorance and retardation, among the global population. And we see this even among the religious groups. And so as an example, if you read the ancient Jewish texts, the exoteric Jewish texts, you have many of the leading Rabbanan suppressing knowledge and wisdom. As an example, we find in certain ancient Jewish texts that the Rabbanan very expressly prohibit learning Greek and studying the texts of the Greeks and other cultures and peoples. And you could argue that to a large extent that has its merits, but you can also argue that has its cons. And indubitably, it has its cons. Now, the Grand Masters of Israel take a different approach, right? And this is the approach that I personally follow, right? If you read the Zohar, there's a section in the Zohar where the Rashbi, he basically tells his disciples, listen, I have studied all of the religions around the world. Okay, so the Rashbi was a polymath, an intellectual of the highest order, probably a polyglot. And he says, I have all the knowledge and wisdom of the world. I've studied all of the religions around the world, all of the cultures, everything. And I can sit here today, I can stand here today and tell you and prove to you the superiority of the ancient Israeli Kabbalah over all other systems of theosophy. That's why the Rashbi was the Mashiach. He was a divine man of the highest order. I think a lot of people can recognize this and see this. Of course, there are a lot of people that are very stupid and ignorant and don't know any of this. And so the Grandmasters, if you belong to the Holy Order, if you've ever met a true Grandmaster, right, they are polymaths. I personally am a polymath. I've stated on record. I have an IQ of 200, an SQ of 200. I am a polyglot. I know several languages, and I'm very well read. I've read all of the Kabbalistic texts under the sun. I've studied Hindu theosophy. I've studied Buddhism. I've studied Islam. I've studied Greek philosophy very extensively. I'm like the Rashbi. I'm like a divine polymath, so to speak. Okay, and so this is what distinguishes the Grandmasters from everyone else, right? As an example, look at some of the well-known teachers in our generation, some of them who profess to be Kabbalists, right? If you go to a very well-known, famous Kabbalistic Rob these days, let's say he has a YouTube channel, you go to it, all of their videos will simply be on the Zohar, right? You have one Kabbalist, all he teaches is the Zohar, nothing else. It's very shallow, very narrow-minded teaching, right? When you come to my channel, you see all of the extensive videos I have. I have videos on astrology, on Hinduism, on magic, right? My videos cover a wide array of topics, demonstrating how well learned I am. And you don't see that among everyone else. Every other person is inferior in this sense. They're very narrow in their knowledge. Their knowledge and their wisdom is very narrow, very shallow, compared to a grandmaster, say, like myself. Okay? This is very critical to understand. Now, I'm opening this because this is going to be a rather diverse teaching here, because I'm going to teach a lot of things in this podcast that I think a lot of people just don't know, just out of sheer ignorance. Now, I want to begin, as we get into the essence of the matter, with ancient Stoic philosophy. Now, this is very critical. Remember that the topic of this podcast is the Gnostic Iyob. So before we get into Suffering of Eob, a lot of momentous groundwork needs to be laid. So we're first going to begin with ancient Greek Stoic philosophy. Now, what's not known is we need to ask, what is the root and origin of ancient Greek Stoic philosophy? What are the origins and roots of Greek Stoic philosophy? A lot of ignorance. When it comes to the ancient Greeks, there's a tremendous amount of ignorance. Now, I'm going to give you the truth, the full truth. The facts of the matter are that the origin and roots of ancient Greek Stoic philosophy are the Essenes. Now, we already read in the very ancient oracles in Parashat Bereshit that the nation of Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem. Japheth is the progenitor of the Greek race, and Shem's the progenitor of the Hebrew race. This is very well known. If you belong to a holy order, you've been initiated at the highest levels, you know that when we study the ancient Greeks, their philosophy, their theology, it's an inferior image of the true ancient Hebrew philosophy and theology. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people and even scholars just don't seem to know this, haven't really penetrated how deep and extensive this truth is. Now, so as I stated, the facts are that the root and origins of ancient Greek Stoic philosophy is the Essenes. You had in antiquity many Greeks were so amazed and so impressed by the long-standing order of the Essenes. Some of them were initiated into the order of the Essenes. These became the grandmasters of the Greek Stoic philosophers and carried on much of the philosophy of the Essenes over into Greek thought. Okay, this is a fact. If you want to know the quintessence of the philosophy of the Essenes, of Essene philosophy, you study the ancient Greek Stoic texts. Okay, now the overarching theme and topic of this podcast is the suffering of Eob. Now, a lot of people are very ignorant. There's a lot of ignorance on the text Suffering Eob. The amount of ignorance on Suffering Eob and the understanding of Suffering Eob is so grand, just so great that it's, to me personally, it's quite mind-boggling. It's just a sheer demonstration of just the prevalent stupidity that has existed throughout the world for so many generations. Now, and by the way, if I sound like an elitist, well, get a fucking clue. I am an elitist, okay? I'm a holy Merovingian of the highest order, and I belong to the holy order, and I'm a grandmaster of Israel. So get a fucking clue here, okay? Seriously. And don't confuse my declarations of the facts with hubris, because then you'll be a big fucking retard if you do that, okay? Don't be a fucking retard. Don't confuse my declarations of the facts with hubris, okay? Seriously. Now, I'm going to begin with some very powerful quotes from the ancient Stoic philosopher Lucius Seneca. My mistake, ancient, he's Greek, but he's Roman. So the ancient Greek-Roman philosopher Lucius Seneca, highly recommend his writings. Very brilliant, very genius, philosopher. So let's begin. I'm going to begin with a few very powerful quotes in order to introduce the essence of the matter as we get deeper and deeper into Suffering of Eob. Okay, so here's one quote. So he says, "Evils are not punishment, but paternal correctives. They are like exercise to the athlete or medicine to the sick. Good men accept them willingly, for they offer themselves freely to the decrees of eternal fate." So when we look at the Essenes, when we look at the ancient order of the Essenes, they were quintessentially Gnostics, right? Which we teach that this construct is evil. The material realm is evil. It's bad. And so the Essenes rejected the body and the material construct and embraced suffering to the highest extent possible. And we see this echoed in the writings. We see the philosophy of the Essenes echoed in the writings of the ancient Greek Stoics, right? As I just cited this one quote. Now, here's another one. "Nature never suffers the good to be harmed by the good. Between good men and the gods there subsists a friendship with virtue as its bond." Now here's another powerful quote. He says, "You must know that good men should behave similarly. They must not shrink from hardship and difficulty or complain of fate. They should take whatever befalls in good part and turn it to advantage. The thing that matters is not what you bear, but how you bear it." So this is very critical when we analyze Suffering of Eob. We have to analyze Eob's suffering and how he handled his suffering. Okay, so here you have the philosophy of the Essenes is extraordinarily advanced, right? Because when we read Suffering of Eob, what we see is Eob complaining. We see that for many chapters, Eob is complaining, as opposed to what the Essenes and the Stoics teach, which is you shall not shrink from hardship and difficulty or even complain of fate. The thing that matters is not what you bear, but how you bear it. Now, another very powerful quote is, he says, "If you find it strange that these things are beneficial, you will find it no less strange that certain maladies are treated by surgery and cautery and by hunger and thirst as well. No one is more unhappy in my judgment," says he, "than a man who has never met with adversity." Now, you need to consider this citation very, very wisely, as it will be applied to Suffering of Eob. Okay, this is very, very critical. But as we get deep into Suffering of Eob, we're gonna get back to the citation. Another very powerful quote is, he says, "The greater the torment, the greater shall the glory be." All in reference to suffering. This is exactly what we see in Suffering of Eob. His torment and his suffering was very great, which was directly proportional to his glory. So we already see, you should be able to start make the connections and see how this is all quintessentially a Essene philosophy. Now, another powerful citation, he says, "Prosperity can come to the vulgar and to ordinary talents, but to triumph over the disasters and terrors of mortal life is the privilege of the great man." So as you begin to study ancient Greek Stoic philosophy, you will see the overarching themes and threads that run through ancient Greek Stoic philosophy. You begin to understand the true nature of an Essene Tzaddik. Another very powerful, I think one of the most powerful citations is the one I'm going to now quote. You want to listen very carefully and consider this very, very wisely, what he says. He says, if you suppose that anyone is immune, you are mistaken. The man who has long prospered will get his share one day. The man you thought discharged has only been reprieved. Why does God afflict every good man with sickness or grief or other misfortune? This is the trillion-dollar question that everyone asks. The problem, prevalent, viral stupidity and retardation. So he asks, why does God afflict every good man with sickness or grief or other misfortune? The reply he gives is because in the army too, the most hazardous duties are assigned to the bravest soldiers. It is only the picked men that the general sends to surprise the enemy by a night attack, to reconnoiter the road, or to dislodge a garrison. And no man in such an elite detachment will say, the general has treated me badly, but rather the general thinks well of me. Similarly, those told off to undergo what cowards and weaklings would weep over should say, God has judged us fit subjects to try how much human nature can endure. It's very, very powerful, because here he gives a very powerful genius parable to answer this question of why do we suffer. Another very powerful quote is, he says, avoid luxury, avoid debilitating prosperity, which makes men's minds soggy, and which, unless something intervenes to remind them of the human condition, renders them comatose, as in an unending inebriation. Again, this quote, similar to the other quote I just cited, must be considered very, very wisely, because we're going to revisit these quotes as we get very deep into Suffering of Eob. Another very powerful quote is, he says, God is tried by fire, brave men by misfortune. Now, where he states brave men, simply substitute brave man for the Tzaddik. Another very, very powerful quote is, he says, why does God, he asks again, because he gives several answers to this question, why does God allow evil to happen to good men? The reply is very simple. Good men release God from this care, for they themselves despise externals. Well, this is what we see with the Essenes. We see a rejection of the externalities, which in the Kabbalah we call the klipoth, which comprises the material realm and the body at large. So these are some very powerful quotes that you need to understand and consider very, very wisely, and they are very applicable as to Suffering of Eob as we get very deep into Suffering of Eob. Now, before we get into the essence of even deeper into the essence of the matter, I want to discuss Carl Jung for a while. So, Carl Jung is a very famous psychoanalyst and very well respected. Now, we have a problem because when it comes to spirituality and mysticism, we have many occultists and intellectuals flock to Carl Jung, rather unfortunately. Why? As a grandmaster, it's very well known among us on the Holy Order that Carl Jung was very inferior. when it comes to the matters of spirituality and mysticism, Carl Jung is very inferior. Now, I'll give some proofs and seals here. Okay, so for example, Carl Jung wrote a treatise on interpretation of dreams. Okay, now there's a problem. Here you have that, Carl Jung wants to be recognized as an intellectual, as a very well-learned man. He wrote this treatise on interpretation of dreams, a treatise that falls completely on its face. Why? Because when you apply the principles outlined in the treatise to biblical dreams, it falls on its face. It does not properly interpret those dreams. So when you look at the ancient sages, the ancient masters of Israel, and their principles of dream interpretation, they are far superior to what you find in Carl Jung's treatise, on dreams. But another big problem that we have with Carl Jung is that he was clearly not a grandmaster, definitely not a master at all by any means. And so the problem with Carl Jung is that he was a seeker of truth, and he tried to delve into spirituality, into Gnosticism, into mysticism, but he did not have a formal training and initiation into those matters. And so what you have then is you have a very intellectual man who doesn't belong to a holy order and has no formal training or initiation into these matters, and he's trying to delve into these matters. And so you can begin to understand and see the problem then, right? When you have such an individual, is that they're not going to have a full understanding of those matters because they don't have formal training, they don't have formal education, they don't have formal initiation into these matters. So they're only going to get so far. Unfortunately, Carl Jung didn't get very far in his exploration of spirituality and mysticism and Gnosticism. To a grandmaster like me reading his text, this is most clear. To the vulgar, to most occultists who are ignorant, uninitiated, to me it's clear they don't understand this. They can't see this. Now, the great praise to Carl Jung is that, well, kudos to him for at least attempting to explore spirituality, and Gnosticism. It's a good thing. I mean, it's great that he tried to explore these areas and he tried to discover as much as he could, and he did, he did understand certain matters very well, and did reveal certain matters very well, but he was no grandmaster or master by any means. So his inferiority and his lack of formal initiation and training to a grandmaster like myself is very, very evident. Okay, now one of the highest tools and proof of this is one of his magnus opuses, which is his book, Answer to Eob. Right, this is one of his most famous books and texts. Now, I read this entire book of Carl Jung, and it's a really good book, but it's very inferior, right? As a grandmaster reading this book, it was very evident to me, as I've already stated, that Carl Jung was doing his best, not being a master, not being a grandmaster, not being fully initiated, not even partially initiated. You can see his attempt to explore these esoteric matters of spirituality, mysticism, and Gnosticism, but it's very inferior because he never reaches the full understanding. He only gets part of the way, right? So here's where he gets part of the way, right? So I'm going to briefly review part of the way that the very short part of the way that he reaches. And then I'm going to reveal to you the full understanding, the full esoteric understanding of Suffering of Eob that has been concealed for thousands of years, that has never been revealed, and that will openly be revealed here for the first time in this podcast, okay? So if you read the book, what I would say is the genius of Carl Jung is that for the first time, he is revealing very ancient Gnostic arcana, right? in the book, he intimates, rather implicitly, sometimes rather explicitly, the sheer inferiority of God in the book. Right? In the book, we are equating God with Yod He Vav He in the book, and he is psychoanalyzing this encounter between Yod He Vav He and Eob. And what I would say is the genius and the great intellect of Carl Jung is that he is able to fully understand the sheer inferiority psychoanalytically of God in the text. And then throughout the text, he tries to introduce basic terminology of Gnosticism for whatever reason, maybe to impress the reader, I don't know. But the truth of the matter is that from reading the text, it's very evident that he is not fully initiated. He's not a master, he's not a grandmaster. He's just doing his best with the tools that he has to explore these very esoteric matters. And he does gain traction, and he does reach certain levels of understanding. But the problem is he doesn't reach the highest and fullest levels of understanding. And that's the inferiority of Carl Jung. It's not to take away that he was a genius in his own regard and was very intellectual in his own way. Okay, it shows in the text, in him analyzing psychoanalytically this encounter between God and Eob. And I would say that the genius of the book is just demonstrating the sheer inferiority of God. Now, this is the first level. This is the first gate into the arcana of the book. This is a Gnostic text. So the first level is understanding that Yod He Vav He and Suffering of Eob quintessentially is the demiurge. He is the Altabaoth. He is Samael. That is who this God is. At this point, in order to fully understand the rest of this podcast, you need to be a true initiate and adept. I haven't done any videos or teachings fully revealing and giving all the proofs and seals of ancient Gnostic arcana. You have to belong to a holy order for that, or discover it on your own. But if you're highly initiated, you've come to know that the God of the Old Testament is Samael, is Ya'al-Dabaoth, is Lucifer. It's a very inferior God. And that's what we're dealing with here. The demiurge is Lucifer. And this is very evident, right? The clear proof of this is, when Lucifer finally comes before Eob, what does he do? Is this a loving God? Right? See, the true God, the true God that we worship, that is only known among the elite grandmasters, is a very loving God. And after such a brutal encounter and event taking place, a loving God would descend and show nothing but immense love. But we don't see this. The very first encounter between Lucifer and Eob, Lucifer is bragging. He's like, "Look at me, who are you? I've done all this, I've created the whole world. Have you done this?" I mean, it's like an ego trip. So here we have Eob has suffered immensely, he's in deep need of consolation. And here he meets the God of Israel. And the first thing the God of Israel starts doing is basically go on a big ego trip. Like, are you fucking kidding me? This is the God you worship? See, this is the God that Christians and Jews worship. This is the God that the Muslims worship. This inferior God. This is who they worship. They worship Lucifer without even knowing it. Total fucking retards. You can't read this text and understand what's going on. It takes, I mean, at this point, I have to admit that it takes a ridiculously great intellect of the highest order to fully understand these arcana. Because unfortunately, the vast majority of people are born into this construct as slaves and with very weak, very, very exceedingly weak intellects. This is what observation, tells me. I mean, the empirical evidence for this is everywhere. So, and Carl Jung, shows this very well in the book, because he's analyzing this psychoanalytically. And so from a psychoanalytical perspective, it's very evident that we're dealing with a very inferior God here. This is not the true God. So now we need to ask, what was going on in the beginning? In the beginning, we read that Iyob was very blessed. Here we have a man who's very powerful, very wealthy, has everything he needs, is very well taken care of. Now this goes back to the Essene philosophy. If you are in a scene like I am, you're very ascetic, you reject luxury. You embrace suffering. Now, if we go back to ancient Gnostic thought, what was the Garden of Eden? And why did the demiurge want Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden, Eden in Hebrew means luxury. That's what it means. Luxury quintessentially is slavery. You read the ancient Greek Stoic texts. I just recently provided a citation from Lucius Seneca, expressly indicating that luxury is slavery. Luxury is death, quintessentially. You're in a comatose state. For a man to be in a great throne of luxury is to be comatose. Spiritually, the individual is comatose. You see all of these wealthy, powerful men around the world, famous singers, actors, very wealthy people. They're all spiritually blind and comatose. They are spiritually dead. They have no understanding at all. They have no spiritual life. They are in complete subjection and slavery to the demiurge, who is Lucifer, without even knowing it. So if you are initiated and very familiar and have mastered the ancient secret Gnostic texts, then you know that the demiurge, his sole intention and desire was to enslave mankind in this Garden of Eden, which allegorically is luxury, as indicated by the Hebrew word Eden. So up comes along the serpent, and the serpent is the holy goddess, or the Mashiach. She is the Mashiach. The holy goddess is the Mashiach. We do not, at the highest levels, we do not equate man with the Mashiach, but the holy goddess. So the holy goddess comes in the form of a serpent to liberate Adam and Eve, parabolically to liberate mankind, to give them da'ath, gnosis. But once you eat the forbidden fruit, forbidden by the demiurge, who is Lucifer, that's when you then get kicked out of the garden. You are then kicked out of luxury. And that's when you begin suffering, true affliction. Because gnosis quintessentially is a function of suffering and affliction. Now, we've come to understand the Essene philosophy in embracing suffering. And we have to understand why suffering is so momentous and so critical to spiritual life and development. Now, I now will introduce Saint John of the Cross. Now, Saint John of the Cross was a grandmaster mystic in his generation. Now, very interestingly, Saint John of the Cross lived right around in the same generation as the Arizal. In that generation, two of the highest, most powerful divine sparks fell from heaven, vis-a-vis the Arizal and Saint John of the Cross. Both were Jews. Saint John of the Cross, it's very well known. He was a crypto Jew. And both became grandmasters. The Arizal became the grandmaster of Israel, the Mashiach, and the Saint John of the Cross became the grandmaster of Christianity. Some of the most powerful, one of the most powerful books are the writings of Saint John of the Cross. If you haven't read the writings of Saint John of the Cross, you haven't begun true holy initiation. That is a fact. The writings of Saint John of the Cross are all solely about reaching the first gate that I'm always speaking about, that all grandmasters speak about, which is the gate to the holy goddess, which is Malkuth. That's all his writings are about. All his writings are about Malkuth. It's very interesting that the Christians didn't catch on to this. The Christians were so fucking stupid. You have parts of his writings where he's literally making reference to the holy goddess. At one point, explicitly stating, and bringing up the wife of Yeshua, who was Miriam, the prostitute. This guy was a full-blown Gnostic. And yet you have all the Christians reading this, praising him, and I guess all this just goes over their head, or they're just really fucking blind and stupid. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's all of the above. But that's quintessentially what his writing. All his writing is all about one thing: accessing and entering the gate, the first and foremost gate, which is the gate of Malkuth. And that's all his writings are about. Now, what does this all entail? It all comes down to one thing: suffering, affliction. And he says that the road, as Yeshua taught, the road to the kingdom of Malkuth, to the kingdom of God, which is Malkuth. Malkuth is kingdom. Malkuth Eloah, the kingdom of the goddess. That gate is very narrow, and few ever enter it. Because why? Because most people can't handle suffering. Most people, the vast majority of people, listen, as an elitist, as a full-blown fucking elitist of Israel, no different than the Luciferians that run the world, much of the world is full of useless eaters, stupid, ignorant people. Most people, we look down upon most people as just being really fucking stupid and ignorant. I mean, that's the reality. And if that's the case, then go figure, most people can't handle suffering, don't want to suffer. This is why Yeshua said the gate is the road is very narrow, and few people enter, because most people, they don't want to suffer. Saint John of Cross, this is what he says. He says the amount of suffering that you have to endure to reach that gate is so great, so powerful, that very, very few people ever can handle that and get into that. We're talking only a handful of people. The suffering is very great. And let me just tell you, from my own personal experience as a Tzaddik and Grandmaster, my whole life, I personally view my life as shitty. I say, I'm on record numerous times, everyone that knows me, I have a really fucking shitty life. I hate my fucking life. Much of my life has been nothing but suffering and afflictions, all so that I can reach and access that gate. It is written in the last book of the Bible, in the book of the Apocalypse, that the Latter-day Saints will hate their lives unto death. Quintessentially, they will be suicidal. I am suicidal. I hate my fucking life. I do not like to suffer, but I've endured it. I'm doing it. So this is the narrow. This is the narrow path. Okay. Now, if you read Saint John of Cross, you have to be fully initiated and have mastered this text to get really deep into this matter. But to sum it up, the point is that the amount of suffering, in order to actually, he says, in order there are he says it's only a small, very very small handful of people have reached the gate, because the amount of suffering, and this is what he says. He says the amount of suffering that it takes is on par with the suffering that we see in the book of Eob, with the suffering that we see in the life of Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua HaNatziri. That's the type of suffering that a soul must endure to reach the gate. It's not easy. This is why we say only a handful will reach that gate, because you have to make a divine contract. I made a divine contract very early on in my life with the gods. Not with Lucifer. I made a divine contract with the Holy Goddess and the Mashiach, not Lucifer. I'm not like all the fucking stupid retarded goyim that make contracts with Lucifer and demons. That's total fucking retardation. So the amount of suffering, you can't even put words on the amount of suffering that is required. So if you go back to Sefer Eob, we see what we have here allegorically and parabolically is the ideal soul. Now, initially, the soul is born into slavery, into the slavery and bondage of this construct that is run by the demiurge, who is Samael. And this is what we see with Eob. Initially, he is spiritually comatose. The initial description of Eob is of a spiritually comatose soul. And he's right in the hands of the demiurge. He's right where Lucifer wants him. All of a sudden, Satan comes before the demiurge. Now, who is Satan? You're taught that Satan is the bad guy here. He's not. Satan is the good guy. We've already indicated that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh here is the demiurge, who is Lucifer. So, ergo, Satan here is the good guy. Well, the good girl, you could say, because Satan here is the holy goddess. It's the Mashiach. The word Shaitan in Hebrew has the same gematria as Mashiach. Tells you everything you need to know about who this entity is. Now, the entity comes and challenges the demiurge, because the demiurge is very foolish. The demiurge compared to the holy goddess, who is her son, it's a very foolish, stupid entity. Doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. So now the holy goddess comes, and she perfectly describes what's going on. And she says, you have Eob right where you want him. You have him as a slave in a spiritually comatose state, in complete luxury. He's in complete luxury in the Garden of Eden, allegorically speaking. So the holy goddess says, if you were to take around those hedges around him, he would curse you to your face. He'd curse you. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. We read in Sefer Eob, chapter 1, verse 11. You want to open up your Bible now. Go to your Bible. If you have an app, go to the app. Or get your Bible. Hopefully you know Hebrew. In Sefer Eob, in chapter 1, verse 11, it says, "Put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Now, the Hebrew word there for curse is barach. The root word barach is used for curse. Now, if you're fluent in Hebrew, you know that barach means to bless. Now, this is where you have to be very highly initiated. If you're very highly initiated, you're very fluent in the ancient Jewish texts, you understand the dichotomy of many Hebrew words. We have a thesis and antithesis running through many Hebrew words. The word barak is a classical example. That the word barak can, on the literal level, means to bless, but it can also euphemistically signify to curse. This is one perfect example in this verse. The word barak is used. It's very evident from context that cursing is being signified, not blessing. Okay. Now, if we scroll down, excuse me, if we scroll down to verse 21, chapter 1, verse 21, Iyob then says, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither." Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh gave, and Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh had taken away. Then it says, "Blessed be the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh." Now, again, the word here that is used is barak, for blessed. So we have to ask the question, knowing that barak has these two meanings, that it can either mean thesis, blessed, or antithesis, cursed. We could naturally translate the verse as "Cursed be the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh," in which case he is now cursing the demiurge. Now, in context, what is he saying? He's very upset now that all of this suffering has taken place. In context, he's very upset. So we could very naturally state, in this state of great tribulation, he's not really blessing the name, but actually cursing it in reference to the demiurge. This is where it gets very interesting, because there's a lot of very powerful secrets here that I have chosen not to reveal or disclose at this time. But suffice it to say, what we have here quintessentially is the redemption of the soul. Because as stated initially, we had a spiritually comatose soul. And now the Holy Goddess comes to redeem that soul by fooling and tricking the demiurge to release that soul from his dominion and transfer it over to her dominion. And the process entails great suffering. So now Suffering Eob has to endure this he endures this powerful great suffering. Why? To spiritually wake up Eob. And so then what we have then here is what then takes place from the moment the Holy Goddess enters the picture, what then takes place is the process outlined very extensively by St. John of the Cross. In which this soul then at the end reaches the gate of Malkuth. Now, let's talk about suffering. Let's get really deep into the arcana behind suffering. We've already explicated aspects of it in the beginning. Now, it was the very famous Russian writer Dostoevsky that is very well known as saying on record in one of his books that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. It's very powerful. It's one of the most powerful statements ever expressed. Now, I wanna bring up a very famous Hollywood show that recently aired over the past few years called Westworld. Now, this show Westworld is mostly about artificial intelligence. So it was a very famous show around the world. What's not known is that the producers and creators behind this show belonged to the Illuminati. It was members of the Illuminati that had a hand in the creation of that show. You have to be very highly initiated to know this. Very, very highly initiated. Now, in the show, and you have to be very high up in the Illuminati to know this, it is expressed quite extensively that the quote-unquote waking up or the introduction of consciousness into artificial intelligence is largely a function of suffering. This is for the longest, this has been very, very esoteric illuminist understanding. It is the method of the Illuminati to reveal arcane truths through mass media, through fictional bases. Now, let's get really deep here. We have to talk about satanic ritual abuse. So, the Illuminati and some of the highest Luciferians practice satanic ritual abuse. Why? Because it is, as I've already quoted Dostoevsky as saying, that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. The reality and the arcane truth, this is one of the highest arcane truths, is that consciousness, you're going to want to listen to me very, very carefully. This is very, very deep, very esoteric, and very profound. You need to consider this very, very, very wisely. Incline thine ear very well to what I'm about to say. Consciousness, quintessentially, is largely a function of suffering. And this is why we said that on the onset, Iyob was spiritually in a comatose state. This is pure mysticism here. And the awakening factor, the sole awakening factor from that spiritually comatose state was suffering. It was the great suffering of Eob that introduced true consciousness, specifically true consciousness of the divine. And what we see in satanic ritual abuse is that when you amplify the satanic affliction and suffering, what happens? What we see in the patients of SRA is enhanced consciousness on many levels. Suddenly they are endowed and endued and bestowed with photographic memory, superhuman intellect, superhuman strength. The Illuminati, the Illuminists, these highest ranking Luciferians, they know what they're doing. They know what's happening. Satanic ritual abuse opens up gateways and pathways to higher consciousness. Now, the Holy Goddess is the perfect artisan, is the perfect controller. She knows how to perfectly dial all the buttons, all the levers, and perfectly control the suffering of the soul so that no internal damage is done, as what we see with satanic ritual abuse. But satanic ritual abuse perfectly highlights this arcane truth that consciousness is largely a function of suffering. Because what we see here, so this is what we see. So the divine suffering is on a much more micro scale than what we see with satanic ritual abuse, but the effects are the same vis-a-vis enhanced and upgraded consciousness. Now, I have revealed more than enough. We have not explored and penetrated all the levels in Suffering of Eob yet. Here, I can no longer continue. I will end the podcast here. Further penetration is left to you, listeners. Shalom wa salam.